And so now let's take a review of homework exercise number 12. And this will be a much more challenging homework assignment, in part because you have no multiple choice options given. This should be more difficult than the quiz that you'll take. The quiz will be in the format of exercise 11 with the multiple choices available. But this exercise 12 should give you an additional challenge. And if you do well on this, I expect that you should do well on the quiz. So the instructions are similar, except that without the multiple choices, you need to identify the pattern of argument or the fallacy at work in each of the following items. So we begin with number 1. She is often tired, has been gaining weight, is often nauseous, and missed her period 3 weeks ago. There's a good chance she's pregnant. So in this instance, we draw the conclusion there's a good chance she's pregnant. We don't know that for certain, but we're basing it on observable evidence, right? The observable facts, tired, gaining weight, nauseous, missed her period, these are all signs of pregnancy. And so this would be the coexistential argument or the argument from sign. Number 2, if we censor child pornography, what will be next? Soon all adult entertainment will be banned. Then criticism of the government will be proscribed. Then we will lose all freedom of speech in the press. I say, don't even start down the path of approving censorship. So the clue here is in the conclusion or claim, I say, don't even start down the path. The down the path reference actually gives you a clue about, it's a descriptive clue of what the fallacy is here. It is a slippery slope fallacy. It's perfectly reasonable, in other words, to ban child pornography, and it doesn't mean all of these other things would happen as consequences necessarily. So again, slippery slope is the unwarranted version of the argument from consequence, and it maintains that a series of negative consequences would inevitably occur when in fact we know we could do a rational intervention at any point in that series of consequences to stop the most extreme of the results. So number 2, slippery slope. Number 3, of course, executions should be televised. Recent surveys show that 70% of the public approve of televised executions. This proves it is the right thing to do. So we have a claim here, televised executions, or we should televise executions, and it's based on evidence that 70% of the public approve of the idea. But that seems to be all of the evidence that's introduced. It adds that it proves it's the right thing to do, but in fact it does no such thing. There is no evidence related to whether or not it's ethical or moral to do that. It's simply a result of the public opinion survey. So we have here the fallacy of the ad populum. That is the ad populum fallacy, the appeal to the people. Number 4, I'm against President Trump's economic plan. After all, the guy has orange hair, he disrespects women, and uses Twitter far too often. So here we have a claim about President Trump's economic plan. We're opposed to it, but the evidence that's given is all about President Trump himself. It's got nothing to do with any investigation or critical thinking about the proposed economic plan. And so this is an example of the ad hominem fallacy. It is an argument directed at the person instead of at the policy. Number 5, the problem with the decline in historical education in America is that we never learn from history. The Russians ran into an interminable quagmire in Afghanistan in the early 1980s at great cost in life and treasure. Things have not dramatically changed, and despite the nobility of our cause, we will end up just like the Russians, with a humiliating retreat and unresolved threat. So in this case, we have two cases compared. We have a known case, what happened to the Russians in the 1980s, and we have a prediction about how our experience in Afghanistan will end, and it's based on analogy. So this is an argument by analogy. Number 6. The new Swedish study of 100 heart patients determined that reducing cholesterol will decrease heart attack risk by mitigating the effects of existing coronary artery disease. American doctors are especially excited by the findings and are determined to prescribe more aggressive cholesterol-reducing regimens, including drug therapy, for their patients. So in this case, we have a Swedish study, 100 heart patients, and we found in that study that reduction of cholesterol reduces or decreases heart attack risk. So that's a causal connection. Reduced cholesterol causes decrease in heart attack risk. Okay? And so that causal projected property is found to be true in the Swedish study that is the sample of 100 heart patients. And then we find that the argument generalizes the findings to American heart patients or any patients of American doctors. And so we have the causal part and the generalization part. As with many medical studies of this sort, it is a causal generalization argument. Number 7. Her star chart was unfavorable, Mars being in retrograde and the moon in its second phase. I'm sure that is why she failed the quiz. So in this case, we obviously have a causal argument. The claim says that the reason why, or the cause for the quiz failure, was the unfavorable astrology chart. And so we would ask whether or not that kind of causal claim or causal explanation is warranted or not. We would test the causal claim by applying the tests of necessity and sufficiency. So in other words, is it necessary to have an unfavorable astrology chart in order to fail a quiz? And is it sufficient to have an unfavorable astrology chart as a cause for failing the quiz? And I think in both cases we would answer no. It's not necessary to have an unfavorable chart to fail a quiz. If you didn't study or if you didn't go to class, you would fail it even if your chart was favorable. So it's not necessary, and it's certainly not sufficient. So in other words, you could be the best student in the world, and if your astrology chart is unfavorable, that's unlikely to be the cause for failing the quiz, right? So in other words, there's limited evidence to show that there is a causal connection between an unfavorable astrology chart and quiz failure. You could also apply the tests of negative cause cases and negative effects cases. You could ask, are there a number of students who failed the quiz who had favorable astrology charts? In other words, they were negative cause cases. Or you could ask, were there students who had unfavorable astrology charts and who still did well on the quiz? And those would be negative effects cases. So however you approach it, this causal explanation is obviously unwarranted. So there's a fallacy. And perhaps the best fallacy to identify is the false cause fallacy or the single cause fallacy. Either one of those would be sufficient. I think you could also say this commits the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, although there isn't any explicit reference to chronology or sequence in time, which may mean that the false cause fallacy is the better answer. In any case, on the quiz, you wouldn't get all of those choices. There would be one clear answer as the best fallacy to identify in an example like this. Number 8. Less than a week after the Trump administration came into office, the national unemployment rate dropped. It shows that when a Republican is in control, it will be easier for the middle class and small business to have economic success. So here again, another causal argument, but in this case, there is a clear and explicit reference to chronology, that is, to sequence in time, the opening phrase, less than a week after. So the argument implies that a week after the Trump administration came into office, the unemployment rate dropped. So the unemployment rate dropped because the Trump administration came into office. Now, perhaps that's the case, but we can probably find negative cause cases and negative effects cases, that is, instances when Republicans took over the administration and the unemployment rate went up, or cases where Democrats came into office and the unemployment rate went down. And those negative cause and negative effects cases would point out the fact that this is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. And that fallacy, better than, say, the single cause fallacy or the false cause fallacy, mainly because of the explicit reference here to the sequence of time. Number 9. He asked 12 of his friends, and only one had seen the new Avengers movie. I'm telling you now, this is clear evidence, despite all the hype, that the film will bomb. So in this instance, we have a prediction about what will happen, that is, what will be the general reaction of the American public to the new Avengers movie, but that claim is based on the limited evidence of a sample of 12 of this individual's friends. And so we would recognize this as a hasty generalization. It is a generalization based on a sample that is not representative. First of all, you had to be friends with this person in order to be included in the sample. So it wasn't a random sample. And very likely people have friends that are like them, so they're probably not including all the differences among the various members of the population, the wider population, the differences that would make a difference, whether that's things like age, sex, race, income class, and the like, as well as tastes in entertainment and that kind of thing. So a hasty generalization. Number 10. As usual, any serious attempt to keep our children from being brainwashed by the minions of political correctness in our public schools is scurrilously attacked by the hypersensitive feminazis and the multiculturalist know-it-all elites. Our children, indeed our entire way of life, is in grave danger from these subversive forces. So in this case, we have a claim about our way of life being endangered, as well as the difficulty of keeping our children from being brainwashed. But we look at a term like brainwashed or like subversive. We see other terms like hypersensitive feminazis and multiculturalist know-it-all elites. And obviously the argument intends to get us to respond or react to the language and to respond and react in an emotional way. So this is an example of the emotive language fallacy. Number 11, we should not allow marijuana use for medical treatment. If we legalize marijuana, next thing you know, the drug counterculture will have our children buying crack cocaine out of vending machines at the movie theater. And of course, this is a hyperbolic version of the argument from consequence. It is an argument from consequence in the sense that we see the next thing you know, these consequences will follow. But because it's an unwarranted argument from consequence, we would also recognize it as an abbreviated version of a slippery slope argument, where we go from the first step, which is perfectly reasonable, using marijuana for medical treatment, to a kind of outrageous, exaggerated outcome in the end of children buying crack cocaine out of vending machines at the movie theater. There is, of course, no necessary reason why that would inevitably follow from the first reasonable step of allowing marijuana for medical uses. So the slippery slope fallacy. Number 12. At the annual motorcycle week at Lake Winnipesaukee, bikers spent nearly $4 million on rooms, meals, and souvenirs. It appears that 2020 will be an excellent recovery year for New Hampshire's merchants, and that there will be sufficient tax revenue to eliminate the state budget deficit. So in this case, we have a prediction, the prediction about how 2020 will be an excellent recovery year. And it's based on evidence of what happened at Lake Winnipesaukee during Motorcycle Week. So we have a kind of generalization argument that the economy in general is going to be good, and it's based on a sample of 1 week, Motorcycle Week at Lake Winnipesaukee. However, we could ask, is that sample representative? That is, does Motorcycle Week at Lake Winnipesaukee represent the general trend that is carried throughout all of the state of New Hampshire and through the rest of the year? And in this case, we would have to say it's probably not a representative sample. It's not big enough. It covers only 1 week of commerce and income and tax revenue. It's also refers to activity of one particular type, Motorcycle Week, which attracts a certain kind of person, perhaps not representative of the general economic activity of people, both citizens and visitors to the state of New Hampshire. So a hasty generalization. Number 13, we shouldn't spend money putting computers in the public schools. Study after study has shown that students in the public schools don't know how to use computers. Why should we pay for these expensive tools that would sit idle in the classrooms because nobody knows how to use them? So here, this is kind of a ridiculous argument when you actually begin to look at it critically and closely, because the claim is we should not spend money putting computers in the public schools, and the reason is students don't know how to use computers. But of course, what would be the reason to put computers in the schools except to teach students how to use the computers? And so the argument begs the question, or it's a circular argument. So circular argument fallacy, a version of begging the question, because essentially the premise that is offered, or the evidence that is offered, is simply a restatement of the conclusion that students don't know how to use computers. Number 14. State law clearly mandates that 0.08% alcohol in the blood is a felony DWI, so it is apparent that we should not permit drivers under 21 to drink after dark. So in this case, we have a claim signaled by the argument indicator so. It's apparent that we should not permit drivers under 21 to drive after dark. Well, okay, what's the evidence? In this case, the evidence is the law regarding the alcohol level for a felony DWI. But that evidence doesn't speak to the point at issue addressed by the claim. In other words, the evidence here is irrelevant to the claim, so we have an example of the non sequitur fallacy. Number 15. The Republican agenda commits the party to a balanced budget, a tax cut, and increased defense spending. The only way this can be done is to cut Social Security. The Republican agenda should be rejected because it cuts Social Security and abandons the nation's commitments to its older citizens. So in this case, the claim is Republican agenda should be rejected, and the basis is the evidence that comes before. Notice here how several aspects of the Republican proposal are discussed: balanced budget, tax cut, increased defense spending. And then from all of that, a focus is drawn only on the question of Social Security, and not a proven cut in Social Security, because apparently the Republicans didn't say they wanted to cut Social Security, but that's assumed by the person making the argument. And so on the basis of that assumption, again, undocumented assumption, if we go by what's in the argument here, on the basis of that assumption, the person then draws the conclusion to reject the Republican agenda. But this would be an example of a straw man argument because, again, we're misrepresenting the position that we are attacking. So the Republican plan does include all of those aspects, but it doesn't include explicitly a recommendation to cut Social Security. So there wouldn't be any reason to point that out specifically as the basis for rejecting the agenda. So in this case, the straw man argument. Number 16. Churches are constitutionally protected against taxation by the state. Therefore, the constitutional amendment to permit taxation of church property should not be approved because it would violate that sacred constitutional protection. So in this case, we have an argument indicator therefore, which tells us the claim here is the constitutional amendment to permit taxation of church property should not be approved, okay? But the evidence given, because, right, the evidence is the amendment would violate the sacred constitutional protection. What is that protection? It's stated in the first statement here. Churches are constitutionally protected against taxation by the state. But as you probably recognize, this is a circular argument. We have here an evidence statement. Churches are constitutionally protected, therefore the Constitution shouldn't be changed because there's a sacred constitutional protection. So the circularity of the argument. And also notice it begs the question, because circular argument is a variation of begging the question. And begging the question here would be simply, well, what is the whole purpose of a constitutional amendment except to change the Constitution? So even if there is an existing constitutional protection, if you propose an amendment, that amendment would remove that protection, and so it would no longer apply to any case of taxing churches. So begging the question or circular argument, one of those choices, if given in multiple choice, would be the best answer. And again, on an item like this on the quiz, you wouldn't get both of those possible answers. It would be one or the other. Number 17. When sharks smell blood, they circle in schools and close in for the kill. Then the feeding frenzy erupts, and the victim is left as a mangled corpse. It is the same way with professional athletes accused of using performance-enhancing substances. Without evidence, the reputation of these professionals is left mangled and bloody by media speculation and sports radio hyperbole. So in this case, you probably recognize the figurative dimension of the argument. There are a number of metaphors, similes, right? Sharks as the media as sharks. And so we recognize this is a figurative analogy. It is obviously from the similarity category. It is the same way tells us that, right? But it's not a literal analogy because the sharks and the media are not from the same category of experience or the same class of people or objects or things. So in this case, we have a figurative analogy. Again, figurative analogies can be persuasive, they can help clarify, but they can't function as evidence. Number 18. This semester has been like a mystery novel. Each week, like each chapter of the story, has brought new clues to help us solve the puzzle of human argumentative behavior. And I guess like a good mystery, the semester will have an unusual and exciting conclusion. So here again, we see a similarity category. Like each chapter, each week, like each chapter, this semester has been like a mystery novel, so two things compared. And in fact, this is another figurative analogy where mystery novels and academic semesters are not from the same category, but we use the imagery of one to help describe and explain and illustrate the experience of the other. Number 19. If the team builds a new stadium, it will both require significant public investment of scarce state funds and will eliminate the aesthetic appeal of the traditional ballpark, one of the major attractions for the downtown area. Add to this the increase in traffic and parking problems, and we have many good reasons for opposing the stadium plans. So we have many good reasons for, so this tells us here's the conclusion, because the reasons have been stated ahead of time. Here's the conclusion: we oppose the stadium plan. And why? Because of all of these things that will happen. If the team builds a new stadium, what occurs, right? We get investment of state funds that are scarce. We eliminate the aesthetic appeal. We take away a major attraction downtown. We have increase in traffic and parking. These are all consequences, in this case negative consequences, showing the disadvantage of the proposed new stadium. And so we have an argument from consequence. Number 20. Should we have class on Tuesday before Thanksgiving? Just ask the students. Nobody in the class wants to be here the day before the holiday, so the professor should just give us the day off. What do you say, Prof? So obviously we have a claim here. The indicator so tells us the professor should just give us the day off. That's the claim. Sorry about that. That's the claim of the argument. And it's based on what? Just ask the students. It's based on what most of the students or all the students think or hope for or believe. Nobody in the class wants to be here the day before the holiday. So this is an example of the ad populum fallacy, right? That is, the claim is based only on evidence that comes from the popularity of the idea being proposed, not because there is any inherent merits to the proposal. Number 21. I don't know why students fear they will lose control of entertainment programming on campus. As an administrator, I assure you that student input will always be welcome in programming decisions, and ultimately students will control programming by deciding whether to attend events or not. So in this case, we have a denial that students have a good ground to fear losing control of entertainment programming on campus. Now, what do we mean, of course, by control? And as an administrator, I assure you student input will always be welcome in programming decisions. Ultimately, students will control programming by deciding whether to attend events or not. And sure, that's one measure of control. But right now, or in the beginning, what the students fear losing when they talk about losing control is quite a bit different. That is, students now are the ones who are deciding which entertainers, which films, which other activities to bring to campus. And that apparently is being taken away by the administration. And yet the administration shifts the meaning of the word control as it responds to those student concerns. And that shifting meaning, that unstable meaning of the key word here, control, is a clue that this is an equivocation fallacy. Times certainly have changed, says number 22. Times certainly have changed. A campus newspaper from the 1960s reported that the university president ordered residence hall directors to stop drinking and sexual activity after midnight. Now, hall directors can't even smoke cigarettes or tell dirty jokes without facing a conduct hearing. Well, this course is a bit on the humorous side, but we see in it the exploitation of an ambiguity. When the president in the 1960s orders hall directors to stop drinking and sexual activity, is he talking about the drinking and the sexual activity of the students under their charge living in the residence hall, or is he talking about the drinking and the sexual activity by the hall directors themselves. Obviously, in this argument, that second meaning is taken to be the one, and then a response given to that. But of course, the original meaning is actually ambiguous, so we have the exploitation of that grammatical ambiguity, which we call the fallacy of amphibole. Number 23. It is true that from an architectural perspective, the new Libby's Bar strikes an impressive and imposing figure. From a historical perspective, however, the building just does not fit with the authentic colonial-style architecture of the quaint downtown of Durham. The planning board should have required a scaled-down, more traditional building for this landmark tavern. Now, this particular question comes from an old quiz. It refers back to the time after Libby's burned down that they had to rebuild the bar, and it was before all of the apartment buildings and other things in downtown Durham existed, when in fact there was an authentic colonial style architecture of most of the buildings in downtown Durham. But in this case, we notice, of course, the argument saying the planning board should have required scaled down, more traditional building is based on a clash or opposition of perspectives. We have the architectural perspective, which says, yes, indeed, it's an impressive building. However, from a historical perspective, we should have done this instead, right? So the historical perspective is the one that is privileged, or the one that is taken to be the defining perspective for this decision. And so we have an example of the dissociation argument. Number 24. For more than 50 years, the UNH versus UMaine football rivalry has always been played on the final week of the season. Last year, however, the teams played each other in their opening game in August. We should go back to the way it had always been, with the rivalry game at the end of the season. And so as you look at this argument, we see in the conclusion, we should go back, and we also see the revealing phrase, the way it has always been, right? Which tells us this is the appeal to tradition fallacy, because there's no other evidence given for returning the game to the end of the season, other than the tradition of having always played the rivalry game at the end of the season. Now, that can be a reason, but obviously it's not the only reason, because what we have in appeal to tradition is a substitution of the presumption, which goes along with the status quo, the substitution of the presumption for evidence. That is, there's no actual advantage to show that it's better to play the game at the end rather than the beginning of the season. Certainly you could find those kinds of reasons, but there's none of them presented here. Instead, we have the appeal to tradition fallacy. Number 25. The university president has announced his retirement. It follows that he is qualified for full participation in the pension program. So the obvious clue here is it follows that, which is a good way of knowing that you have in here a sort of or quasi-logical argument. That is, it sort of follows the pattern of deductive reasoning, or it mimics or imitates a syllogism. So we have the consideration of categories or classes of things represented by terms. We have the university president. We have people announcing retirement. We have people who are fully qualified for participation in the pension program. And by combining what we know about those categories represented by those terms, we reason that since the president has announced his retirement, it follows that he's qualified for the pension program. And so this is an example of a quasi-logical argument, or of the particular kind that we call the transitivity argument. Number 26. The diplomat thought the videotape was a fabricated fake, but why should we believe an Islamic diplomat from an Arab country? So in this case, we're questioning the credibility of the diplomat, but not on the basis of any evidence that in fact the videotape was a fake, but rather on the basis of who is making the claim that it's a fake. So we have an ad hominem fallacy here, right? So the rejection of the claim that it was fabricated is not based on evidence, but it's based on the person who's making the claim. Number 27. The physically fit and well-trained ROTC cadet could nevertheless not complete the assigned obstacle course quickly enough to test out of the new Gen Ed physical education requirement. It is clear then that the psychology major who hasn't exercised in years has little chance of testing out of the requirement. So in this case, we have a claim. It's clear then that the psychology major is not going to pass the test. Why? Because the less likely thing has already occurred. The less likely thing is that a fit, well-trained cadet would not pass the test, right? And that's happened. So the more likely thing that a person who never exercises will not pass the test is also very likely now to occur. So we have, from the category of similarity, an argument by degree, because the two particulars that are compared or examined here are not equal. We have the physically fit person on one hand and a person who hasn't exercised on the other hand, and even the physically fit person couldn't pass the test, so we can predict with confidence that the psychology major won't either. Number 28. There are only 4 possible explanations for the videotape that shows the Russian leader had foreknowledge of the hacking of democratic computers. It could be a complete fabrication by the CIA, it could be a botched translation by the government language clerks, or it could be a hoax composed by the Russians. Finally, it could actually be authentic evidence of his complicity. Independent forensic experts have proven that the tape is not fabricated. Likewise, independent language experts agree that the English translation from Russian is accurate. The third possibility is very unlikely, since the Russians would not want to deliberately incriminate their leader. It leaves only the explanation that the tape is authentic. He is therefore guilty, as the tape proves. So in this case, we arrive at the conclusion, signaled by therefore, right, that the Russian leader is guilty, as the tape proves, and we arrive at that by considering all of the possibilities and eliminating the ones that evidence shows it cannot be. So in other words, we have the argument by division, one of the variations of the argument by division, in this case arriving at the explanation by eliminating other possible explanations in a consideration of all the evidence. Number 29. Since the new university president took over, donations to the university have increased by 31%. It is clear that the alumni are responding to the leadership of this new campus administration. So in this case, we have a causal claim. It is clear that, tells us here's the conclusion, right? It is clear that what? Alumni are responding to the leadership of this new campus administration. In other words, the increase in donations is a result of or caused by the appointment of the new university president. We also have an explicit reference to time. Since here is not meant as an argument indicator, but only to tell us since a particular time, that is, since the time the new president took over, donations have increased. But what we have here is a substitution of the sequence in time for a cause-effect sequence. In other words, chronology has replaced causality. And so we have the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Number 30. Why should we listen to that student senator's opinion on the proposed alcohol policy? Not only was he arrested for an open container violation, but he's a fraternity brother, and he even flunked Political Science 401. So you probably recognize here another instance of the ad hominem fallacy. Even if all these things were true of the student senator, that is, that he was arrested, that he is a fraternity brother, that he flunked political science 401, none of that is really grounds for rejecting the proposed alcohol policy. The argument says nothing. That is, it gives no evidence that the policy is not a good policy. If it was to be an argument against the policy that was warranted, it would have to say something about the disadvantages that are contained in the policy or the negative consequences which would result from the policy. But in fact, it says nothing about the policy at all. All the evidence is focused on negative things about the person who proposed the policy, and that's the clue that this is an ad hominem fallacy. So that's a long exercise, but it reviews many, if not all, of the different argument forms and fallacies that will be covered on the quiz. If you have any questions on any of the items here or on any of the forms or fallacies from any of the three categories, then please post them on the discussion board.